problem and problems, and to analyze how language contributes to maintaining or contesting relations of power, and how language reveals or naturalizes particular ideologies. And if you go to the next slide, then it has certain features that also Norman Fairclough highlighted. Why is this so important? And in many ways, what he did in developing this was to bring Michel Foucault's theory into practice so that it would work to apply it in the analysis of texts. But there was a theoretical reason, and that's that TODA then analyzes dialectical relations between micro and macro aspects of a particular discourse in a particular field. And then it can reveal ideological workings of a text and how they may trickle down from macro discourses to also micro discourses in the work sphere and even in informal talk. Then methodological, TODA reveals information about social structures, processes and relations. It also reveals inner consistencies in text and discourses. And the historical reason is that text can provide indicator of social change in history. He very much illustrated that also with the notion of hegemony, how new ideas in the past can become hegemonic in some time. And so that has much also to do with power. And politically, it's through text that social control and domination are exercised, negotiated, contested, not so much through violence and arms, but textual positions are very important and discursive positions. And one reason also why it's important, and it's still important today, is that many social researchers do discourse analysis, but they don't really penetrate in the actual text analysis. Often they go straight to the macro to discover patterns. But that overlooks the kind of those four reasons that I've just mentioned. Yeah, may I have the next one? Then the analytical steps that I did for analyzing the agenda of the SDGs, and I assume you're familiar with that agenda since most universities, many municipalities, appellatives and states have adopted it. I've done a narrative analysis, which I often like to use, developed by Margaret Somers. And so I use that often also to do an initial global analysis from a text. So that distinguishes perspectives put into the text. So ontologically, the SDG as agenda, which was developed in 2015 or established actually, has an anthropocentric managerial worldview, like the world is an object, climate is an object, we are a subject, and we can manage it if we, and plus we can also address climate change between 2015 till 2030 if we do all the dots on the agenda. That is, so then the epistemology of it, how do you create knowledge, what knowledge is valid, considered valid. It's a scientific technocrat, quantitative data-driven knowledge base. And so it kind of avoids other forms of knowledge, and we'll see that later in this slideshow in more detail. The public narrative, which is normally very important in also using that analysis, because it means the public connections a discourse makes with journalism, with universities, with governments, whatever, with citizens, that remains very constrained within the scope of the UN itself. And we'll see that also later, because the next step of the analysis is the deictic analysis, so how the text refers to outside space, external to the text, space, time, relations. And of that, I'll show some more details in these slides. Then after that, I also present in the work I've done on this alternative perspectives, which we'll see. And then I've interpreted the outcomes in terms of a deep and shallow ecology, which I'll explain later, as well as a Gramscian approach to hegemony. And then finally, I'll come and I'd like to discuss with you some ways forward for CPDA. Yeah, can I have the next slide? So what I did, and it has been published initially in a handbook of Routledge, a handbook of discourse analysis, and another article is coming out right now in Critical Policy Studies. It's in print. But to give some idea what this agenda does, in the preamble, it says the SDGs are part of the UN agenda for 2015-2030, of a follow-up of the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, which run from 2000 and 2015. And that's important because the MDGs were not fully achieved, but there were also problems for which it was criticized and resisted, especially that the Global South didn't feel included. For the SDGs, they've done that much more, including world leaders from the South. And that, well, we'll discuss that also a bit later, but that much they've done, including, I understood that sustainability itself, sustainable development, was very much as terminology created by a Colombian person, Colombia. So, but then a second point is that the UN agenda represents an ambitious global and universal plan, including targets for the 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships. And that is all, you can read it in the preamble. And the next slide. There's also, there will be no peace without sustainable development, and there will be no sustainable development without peace. Those are big statements. What you don't see in the entire agenda is a definition of sustainable development. It's very much taken for granted. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement the plan. So it's a singular plan to be addressed and attended by everybody in the global sphere. Yeah, and the next slide. So specific discursive feature of the discourse is one that it's anthropocentric, so it still depicts depicts a picture of a world out there that is there to be to deliver what humans need, and now the vulnerability of the Earth is acknowledged, but the repairs again should be so that humanity can continue enjoying all its resources and continue its own business. It maintains a continuous belief on economic growth, most explicitly in SDG 8, which promotes growth, especially for the poorer countries, so as to be able to reach the SDGs. And what I just said, very taken for granted feature, there is no definition, there is no legitimation, there is no rational, there is no mention of alternative options from which this was chosen. Issues such as drought, social inequality, violence are nominalized. So they're like independent challenges, as if there was no relation between them. Absence of analysis of root causes, and in any case, causes and effect, those kind of relations are absent. And it is presented, as I said before, within the context of the UN, and that's displayed in the deictic analysis, and I'll move to that right now in the next slide. So deictic analysis, as I guess you all know, is like, if we can get this a little bit bigger, no? A deictic center is where the speakers are, the utterer of the text, thank you. And then from there, it's temporal references to the context, to the actual history, social context, spatial references, and references to present or imply people to whom the text is addressed. So if we apply that to this agenda, and that's the right column, the deictic center is the UN meeting on 25th of September in 2015, when all the world leaders decided to adopt this agenda. Then the temporal deixis runs from the UN origins in 1945 to the end date of the agenda 2030. The spatial references are all connected to milestones within the UN. Its origins again in 1945, the big Rio Earth environmental conference that took place in 1992. So the context is always within UN events. And then social relations references, those are continuously and exclusive we, so it's we the leaders, we the UN leaders, we set the agenda, and it connects the global world population who will execute that agenda. So those are also examples of typically hegemonic text. There is only one singular taken for granted way forward, which is sustainable development. It's the leaders who lead the show, and it's all citizens in the world that should follow it up. And that is continuously the case in the agenda. Now, if we look at the next slide, I have depicted people from COP26 who showed actually a critical analysis of the whole thing. Maya Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, who spoke up very fiercely, it also became a very famous speech, and Chai Suru, an ecological activist, and we'll also do a deictic analysis. I'll present that in the next slide. And there we see something very different. So for them, the deictic center was the COP26 conference in Glasgow. A spatial deixis was there, not the UN history, but the richest countries as opposed to the vulnerable coastal areas, the SIDS, for which also a specific program was made. That is very much what Maya Mottley is presenting. And her social relations, a split between leaders of the rich countries and the leaders and citizens of poor countries. The rich people are not delivering what they should do to the poor countries. And that is actually dismantling that hegemonic perspective that the UN agenda itself presents of a very united, friendly, well-willing leadership from all the UN leaders, and she dismantles that. On the right, we see the analysis of the Amazon activist, of course, the same deictic center of COP26, but she presents herself as a representative of the history of my people. Of course, her position was different in that Mottley was actually one of those world leaders. She is the Prime Minister of Barbados, but here we have an activist. So she presented herself as a representative of the history of her people. She refers to places like the Amazon jungle, the earth, the rivers, who also had a voice, who spoke to the people. And then the social relations, she talks about her father, the great chief Amir Suri, who taught her to listen to the stars, the moon, the wind as agents that you should listen to, that tell you stories, that indicate what's right, what's wrong, how things are going. And then she brings to the table her friend who was an activist who got killed because he was defending the environment there. And while world leaders remain absent, so also she dismantled that idea of well-willing, unified world leaders. So if you wish, these could be considered counter-hegemonic narratives, but what you instantly see is how they talk about actual real lived experiences and contexts. Yeah, we can go to the next. Then there are, of course, the results, and probably I've told most of them already. So we see embodied, contextualized real life events in a lived history in these alternative discourses. They dismantle the myths in the UN agenda, such as the unity of leaders and their well-doing, and they highlight gaps in the hegemonic discourse, financial fraud, that's in the bigger speech from Maya Motley, and reluctance to actually follow the Paris agreements. Yeah, and the next slide is, so far, is it clear all? Are there any questions about this? Because now we go further to the interpretation, for which I've been using shallow and a deep ecology ethics taken from Nas, a Norwegian biologist who developed this further initially, and other people too, but I have very much worked with his material. And that distinguishes a shallow ecology ethics, which continues to believe in the world as a machine Newtonian metaphor, a continued belief in the man as the master of the universe metaphor, emphasis on biotechnology, isolated short-term solutions. It's focused on goals rather than effects, and it's multi-planet living. Is one of an example of what I would call a shallow ecology ethics. So multi-planet living is like the Elon Musks of this place, who imagine that in 10, 15 years, we can kind of let go of planet Earth and be all over the place, and planet Earth may be a station to direct it all. But there is also actually no, well, we'll come there. Then deep ecology ethics is, and there is also a deep ecology movement, sees the world as a web of life, a continuous web of life of which humans are also a part of a bigger biosphere, part of a organic nature in which that web of life is rooted. David Harvey also talks a lot about that. Long-term systemic and complex solutions, so not independent, fragmented solutions such as the SDGs actually do, but systemic solutions that respect that whole biological web of life. It integrates 12 principles, which I cannot list all here. An awareness of complexity of the biosphere and its balances. Now the famous tipping points that we are threatening to break these balances. Bioregionalism is, examples of these discourses are bioregionalism, to live more in harmony with the region where you are, the local plants and what it gives. One planet living, so that's opposed to multi-planet living, and I think they have an office in London. Permaculture is another example where you really live with the dynamics of what the biosphere gives us and how it works. That was started, I think, in the 70s in Australia. So in those two standards, I've been interpreting both discourses, the one of the UN leaders and the other alternative ones. And if we look at the next slide, thank you. There is an interpretation in terms of ethics, which I've done. So I interpreted the UN agenda as the continuation of a shallow ecology. The reasons for that is that it continues to see the world and nature as a producer for human needs, and greed is probably what I added, but needs. It avoids contextualization and remains in a realm of abstraction and policy realities, paper policy realities. The managerial solutions simplify the problems, and they are insufficient to deal with the complex problems within organic biosystems beyond our direct control. And that is precisely what they don't acknowledge. They assume that humans are in control of the biosystem. It maintains the myth of infinite growth on a finite planet, and it lacks any reflection on root causes. It fails to rethink the relation between humans, other species, and the biosphere. And precisely in my latest article, we are presenting more of those alternative discourses that do present examples of that. Yeah, and the next slide. So those are alternative visions, and I'll show a few of those too in the next slides, but they do constitute a deep ecology. They introduce a critical analysis of erroneous hegemonic myths, and they contextualize the problems and solutions in a systemic, organic, interdependent biosystem. So to see one in the next slide, we see on the left the SDGs as they are, and I'm pretty sure that you've seen that many times. So that's a list of 17 targets, and even though they claim that they're all working together, and sometimes in each goal, they also say how it's related to others. But for instance, SDG 4, which is about education, which you might assume that it's connected to practically all of them, it's connected to none of them. But then on the right, and this is the right part of the slide, and that's the wedding cake hierarchy of SDGs, developed at Stockholm University. And it shows a very different picture. So it shows on the basis the biosphere, the ecology and all. And then comes the social sphere, which is much smaller and relies actually, and they've put to also the relevant SDGs from here to each sphere. And then only at the end, the economic sphere, the economy, which should be in service of all of that. What I've found, especially and made more explicit in this article that's now coming out in CPS, is how the SDGs are really a prolongation also of the knowledge-based economy. So you can see that precisely also how they deal with knowledge, which is very much the same as education in the knowledge-based economy, all fragmented scientific kind of knowledge, also removed from real contexts, a focus on skills and competences. That kind of education, you see it here again in SDG 4. And that is, I think, one of the problems with the fact that they don't define what sustainable development is. It sounds wonderful. It is an empty signifier, so anybody can see in it what they want. But if you analyze it more, it is a sustainable economy at best. And what it tries to do is continue on the same road, but eliminate all the symptoms of it. And there is a funny introduction, a contradiction also in the agenda, that on the one hand, the language is very inclusive. It is also true that indeed there were more rounds of input from many people from many countries before the agenda was established. And there sometimes talk about indigenous knowledge and all those kind of things. But you look at the targets and they are all quantitative, they're all scientific knowledge, they're all yeah, not all possibilities for a transformative knowledge is excluded from it. But it is true, I mean, it's also true that the agenda as an attempt is not totally negative, it's not totally bad, it also gives possibilities for people and states and organizations to participate. The discursive danger of that in that participation, and I think many universities or people who work at universities feel that pressure that you are actually also colonized by the underlying values. So in the end, you're still contributing to a system that maybe you would like to change. But it's also true, and that was more in my handbook article, that there are like 4 sorts of governance and action that is possible within the UN. One is the free market, another is state top-down, another is more like civil activity that you can do more bottom-up, and still, of course, one which I can't quite remember right now. So in that sense, there are possibilities. So one of our suggestions is also, since we still have some 6 years to go, to make use of that participation. That's actually the top layer here. And the number 17, SDG 17, is very much about participation and projects that people can engage in. So it is a mixed, there is all sorts of things you can find in the agenda. Can we go to the next slide? And so if I bring this back, the TODA analysis that I did to the initial features I gave about the TODA, at the macro level, you can say that the SDGs is a continuation in its epistemology, ontology of the knowledge-based economy, and just hopes to undo current negative effects and then continue business as usual. At the meso level, it imposes SDGs in a singular formulation on state universities, hospitals, institutes, which might lead to a reproduction of the inherent knowledge-based economy. And at the micro level, the enthusiasm created through its can-do language that, oh, here they are, that gives the possibility for 4 forms of governance. Entrepreneurship was the one that I forgot. But so it is also still possible to do good things with it. And I'm sure also that there have been some cities have been, you know, there are very good examples also of how the agenda was used very well on its website. So it's not all drama, but if you start analyzing the discourse, and especially a critical discourse analysis, you find quite a few features that we should be more aware of. Then the next slide is more results. So from a Gramscian point of view, the UN agenda presents a hegemonic vision of a singular universal leadership, a singular world population, and a singular model of governments in the peaceful hands of the UN, and with a singular universal narrative. And that assumption was dismantled by the other voices presented above. But also it was very much a we-you discourse, like we are the thinkers, have the mental power, and you guys are going to do it, to follow the agenda. Okay, and then the next slide is, so yeah, we're coming to the last, and there I would like to also have some discussion about this and also other things. But way forwards, I think what's important here is to certainly use the agenda, but question in general, question hegemonic policy agendas, investigate the values and myths that sustain them, and particularly the current persistent myth on illusions of a sustainable growth on a finite planet. And I think that's also important nowadays, because we are thinking that the solution now for climate change is a green transition, but that green transition is far from green. It will exploit even more resources. It will destroy more habitats. Nuclear energy becomes fashionable, and there are many problems with those. So that's also something I think where CPDA should be busy, should engage with. And secondly, CPDA should help analyze and critically gauge future solutions and unlimited belief in technological solutions. And good literature on that is Colbert and Rowling, for instance. And then the next slide. Thirdly, CPDA can and should help to make policy connections between the many bottom-up initiatives and bring this into systemic and creative dialogue with formal policy organs at the local, regional, and global levels so that they can get more powerful than just local initiatives. And finally, CPDA is well equipped to contextualize the SDG, and I think just doing that would be very helpful, because to be with the example of education in Western rich countries is something maybe very different from education in African countries or Asian countries. And that counts for health, that counts for almost everything. So it's important to contextualize them. And when you do that with forms of participatory action research, one of my other big lines of research in theory and also in practice, that could really lead to a very well-organized, practical, transformative research. And I think we have come to the end, which are the references. So I hope this was good, that you were able to follow it all in just half hour.
Thank you.